In this lesson, we're talking about defense against infectious disease. It's topic 6.3. This is part 1 of 2. Here are the dot points that we are going to cover, mainly non-specific immune system processes. All right, so we're going to talk about infectious disease, but disease is a condition that stops the body or any of its parts from working properly. There's so many different types of diseases. You can get a hereditary or genetic condition, or you can acquire some kind of disease like a deficiency, an eating disorder, a mental disorder, environmental lifestyle diseases, tumours like cancer, or we can talk about infectious disease, and that's where most of our talk is going to lie here. So infectious disease is caused by an organism that can enter the body. So here's a whole selection of bacterial infections, but they can also be caused by viruses, fungi, parasites, all those kinds of things. Now, it can be transferred from one person or organism to another, so it can cross species, and our body must have defenses ready to fight it in order to eliminate the foreign organism and the material from our system. All right, so we're going to use some really specific terms here. A pathogen is a microorganism that invades the body and causes the illness, right? Lots of different types of pathogens there. And an antigen is a foreign substance that invades the body, but actually it's the thing that triggers the immune system to work. So usually antigens are proteins on the outside of particular cells. We have antigens in our own cells so that if we have, say, an organ transplant, our body will actually attack foreign cells because that's not us. Okay, in this particular video, we're going to talk about the non-specific immune system, but there is also specific responses to specific antigens, right? So the non-specific is the first and second line of defense, whereas the specific is more the final line of defense or the third. All right, let's talk about our primary defenses. Now, there are physical and chemical barriers in our primary line of defense. Now, it makes sense that our first line is the skin. It has many layers. It's got an outer protective layer to protect us against physical and chemical damage. It's also got sebaceous glands, and they're associated with hair follicles. And what they do is they secrete sebum, so like that facial oil that we're used to, that maintains moisture, and it lowers the pH, and it inhibits bacteria and fungi growth. Now, we also have chemical barriers such as tears and saliva, and they contain enzymes that stop invaders in permanent openings in our skin, like our mouth and our eyes. And we have a mucous membrane, which is kind of the amalgamation between the two. The mucous membrane it's like a thinner, softer layer of skin, and it's in the exposed areas like our mouth and nasal passage and our genitals. It's always moist, right? Bit gross, and it secretes a sticky fluid of glycoproteins, which retains water to allow the site to remain sticky. So the glycoprotein is mucin, that's its specific name. Now, the secretions act as a physical and chemical barrier, okay? They trap pathogens to be expelled or swallowed, like if we're coughing or sneezing or something like that, but they're also a chemical barrier. So they also have some antiseptic properties, and they have enzymes in them like lysozymes that break down foreign material. Now, if we move into our secondary defenses, this is assuming that some kind of pathogen has actually broken or breached our first line of defense. They've made it inside the body. Now, we've still got a sort of non-specific response that can kick in, and that's known as inflammation. All right. Now, once cells are damaged or something has popped inside the bloodstream or things like that, then there are chemical signals that what they do is they increase blood flow to the area. So inflammation means that we get all these things working. It's good that we get inflammation. It means that the system is working, and we see heat, pain, redness, and swelling. And what's happening is that white blood cells are arriving at the scene, so they can do lots of different roles because there's lots of different varieties of white blood cells, but they're actually rocking up like first responders, like ambulance or fireys or something like that. All right, there are 5 main types of white blood cells, and you'll see them in a blood smear of any kind. Some play very specific roles in the immune system, but again, that's in our second video. Now, monocytes, this one here, they're really specific, and what they can actually do is they can leave the tissue and they become what's known as a macrophage. When they leave the bloodstream via, say, the pores between the cells and the capillaries, they go off to the tissue, to the site of the infection, where all the bacterial pathogens might be gathering. Now, once they've left the system, that's when they're called a macrophage. Now, macrophages also are known as phagocytes, and there's other kinds of, say, neutrophils, which are kinds of white blood cells that can also be considered phagocytic cells. Now, the phago part means to eat or devour, and the cyte is a cell. So really, that's what they're doing. They're ingesting bacteria or pathogens, engulfing them, destroying them, getting rid of them, okay? It's pretty rare that bacteria should make it into the bloodstream, but essentially that's what's happening here. We have quite a large white blood cell chasing around a bacterium, it's going to engulf it and break it down and spit out the things that are not needed for the body. So we're using a lot of endocytosis and exocytosis here. This is an incredibly non-specific response. It literally chases down anything that it sees that it's not itself. Okay, hey, you're not my cells, I'm going to eat you. That's all it does. All right, so again, we're assuming that the first line of defense has been breached, and once that happens, there's a bit of a domino effect of reactions that takes place. Now, say that the skin is cut, the blood vessel is severed, might be a big one, might be a small one, and bleeding begins as the blood leaves the blood vessel. Now, clotting has to occur to stop that bleeding, and we know that a clot is kind of this semi-solid gel-like goo. And what it does is it prevents the liquid from leaving the blood vessel. It stops that bleeding from continuing on. Now, if too much blood leaves the blood vessel before the clot is able to form, obviously we get a decrease in blood pressure and there's a potential risk of infection as things come into that site there. Clotting is also known as thrombosis, and it's an extremely complex process involving cellular and non-cellular components of the blood. We don't need to know all this stuff. What we do need to understand is that it is a cascade of reactions, okay, one thing after another, and each previous step is kind of the trigger for the next thing to happen, so that domino effect again. Now, it must be controlled. If it's too slow and the damage isn't blocked up quick enough, we're going to have some blood loss. If we're too keen and our body is clotting almost for no good reason, then blockages can occur in blood vessels. Now, clotting or thrombosis involves many different elements. Now, platelets here, these are cell fragments in the blood, and they can release what's known as clotting factors. These are proteins. Now, any damaged cell also releases clotting factors as a kind of cue for, hey, there's some damage here, can you please fix it up? So clotting factors make platelets really sticky and they clump together or aggregate to form a plug over the opening of the blood vessel. Now, once that blood flow is reduced to the area, because of that constriction, that's a good thing. It means no more blood can escape from where the damage is. Now, there's a whole lot of things going on in this situation, and the clotting factors trigger an enzyme called thrombin here to be created from its precursor, prothrombin. And thrombin makes fibrin. Now, in the plasma, there is a substance that is soluble, okay, it's able to be dissolved, called fibrinogen, And what happens is thrombin actually turns it into fibrin. Fibrin is insoluble, so what it does is it precipitates out in the blood, and it kind of forms a mesh around all the platelets and the red blood cells that are sitting there. So that's what's making that clot right there. Now, if it's exposed to air, that's when we start to see a scab as well. So it really is quite literally a platelet party. If the platelets get sticky, they're helped on by the clotting factors, then all the red blood cells around them start to stick together, and that is your clot. It stops you from bleeding out. All right, now normally clots are later dissolved. When the damage is fixed, we don't need that anymore. They're dissolved and broken up and dissipated out. But if the clots aren't broken up, they can cause blockages. We've talked about blockages, and if the blockages occur in the arteries in the actual heart, then we have coronary thrombosis. And some parts of the heart are then not getting the oxygen and nutrients that they need. If they're not getting those things, there's not enough ATP for the heart muscle to work. And remember, it's contracting all the time. And if the contractions aren't good and regular, then the heart goes into fibrillation, which is kind of like a quivering heart wall. And that's what we also know as a heart attack. Okay, it's an ineffective pumping system. All right, now we did talk about atherosclerosis and those blockages in 6.2, okay, in the blood vessels. But if part of the blockage or that atheroma breaks off, it can damage the epithelial lining of the blood vessels, and it can cause plaques to harden the arteries, and that's obviously a risk factor. But there's so many risk factors for coronary thrombosis or having that heart attack. So high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, family history, diabetes, and being overweight. But, there's many other risk factors, just like any other coronary disorder. All right, so we've only covered about half the dot points here. Stay tuned for video 2.